I didn't know that I was going to get emotional even before I began, but thank you so much, Dean Shelton and Elvira, and all my colleagues here, my former students, my friends, so many people who have impacted my life and the way that I do my work. And it's just an amazing opportunity to have this dialogue, this conversation with the incredible Dr. Guadalupe Valdés, who has been it's an icon of our work, right? Informs our work, informs my work, and is that compañera en la lucha para la justicia social. So we're going to begin our conversation with a framing. And the framing is really about how I have been able to think about what I would share you about what my life's work has been, not just in the products and the activities and the presentations, but also the framing of the work epistemologically. And this slide that you'll see next is really about my reflections of the work that I have done over the years, where I began, my upbringing, and these 4 lenses through which I engage and do my work. It took me a long time to create these elements and to name them, but they really will inform. What you'll see here is our conversation and the examples of the work that I've done. And it couldn't have happened without so many people who have led my learning. My mentor and friend, Dr. Reynaldo Macias, who is from USC and was the first person in my doctoral program who really challenged me. We've all had people who've challenged, but also who supported me. And those models, my teachers, my models, my family, really helped inform this process. So having epistemological clarity is a concept that I encourage my doctoral students to have. The doctoral students who are beginning their journeys, and pedagogically for teachers to have ideological and epistemological clarity. So this allows us and allowed me to name what I think, what I do, how to organize my thinking, and how to carry out these 4 interconnected concepts. So the first one is how I learn and what I believe in learning, how I've learned and those who have supported me in this idea of the dialogic, of sociocultural principles and engaging with and for each other through a community of practice, through communities that we share values and engage together, and that we really construct together new knowledge. Everything I've learned, and I continue to learn, I have learned with and through mentors, teachers, friends, colleagues, children who have been such an essential part of my learning how to teach. They taught me how to teach when I was a beginning teacher. The other, and these are all connected ideas, right? They're not disconnected. This idea of mujerista pedagogy. I talked about children and how being a woman, how being a Latina, how growing up Latina in this culture has really formed my identity, informed my language use. The mic is not working. Thank you. And continue to create the way in which I engage with others, the way of being in the world, through lenguaje, through language, culture, and identity. This idea of, I'm going to switch to the other side, transformative civic engagement. What that has meant to me goes back to my early days in coming from a family who was really impacted by political strife and the idea of having governmental oppression, the idea of having to leave your country and leave everything, and the importance of being engaged civically as an educator, as a person, as a human being, and the work that I've done through the opportunities that I've had to partner with others to help make systems change happen. I will talk a little bit more about that later. And the idea of hope and action, being an optimist, but being very cautious and careful in how I construct and co-construct and engage politically to ensure that public policy, education policy is uplifted in ways that can continue to support English multilingual learners and their families and community and schools. So these 4 frames and this opportunity this evening allowed me to speak with Guadalupe over the past few months and thinking about what would be important to share with you about how I go about thinking about my role, my being in the world, my potential contributions, the work that I want to do, the work that I have done, and the work that we will continue to do together. So, what will it take to achieve linguistic justice, and what does it have to do with moral and ethical leadership? Well, from a linguist point of view, we know that every language is cognitively and communicatively equal, and that the diversity that we have as humans within and across languages is something that we as humans have been the oppressors. We've had colonial language, we've sought to label and categorize language through the utterances of speakers in every language that we have. And that's based on our own beliefs about category, about standard language. We know that our imperative as leaders, wherever we stand, we can be a leader in a classroom or a leader in an administrative position or a leader in public policy, calls us to react against and fight against all kinds of injustices. And we know, as some of our scholars who we see, some of your students who talk about what looks like what linguicism is really about, racism. We want to fight against monoglossic ideologies that have positioned us to think about and label and stigmatize and marginalize others who speak different varieties of language. And I'm speaking about not just Spanish and not just English, but all kinds of varieties of languages. So these four frames are the frames that hopefully you'll see operationalized and manifested in some of the conversation that Guadalupe and I will have, and also in some of the work that has evolved over my lifespan and my professional work.
Well, it's a delight to be here and to be able to engage in this dialogue with Magali, whom I've admired for so many years. So I have a first question for you. So you began your career as a bilingual paraprofessional. Then you were a teacher, then a teacher educator. So what ethical and moral considerations does linguistic justice have to do with preparing teachers and with the education in the workforce in general? Can you tell us about that?
Well, I have had the good fortune of coming to LMU as a very new professor to help launch the bilingual teacher preparation program. And one of the aspects of that beginning was being able to see and support beginning teachers in the supports that I did not have as a beginning teacher or in my bilingual teacher preparation program. And that meant really countering a lot of the stigmas that we felt as bilingual teachers. That when I began in 1984 as a teacher, the bilingual teachers in our school were very much marginalized in their experiences because people said out loud that you became a teacher or you were selected only because you speak Spanish, and it has nothing to do with your pedagogic preparation or your pedagogic talent and skills. So it was with that in mind about preparing the best bilingual teachers and to be able to connect back to the idea of honoring all the bilingual repertoires. So a lot of my work in the beginning, Guadalupe, was also informed by some of your later work, especially in the idea of honoring bilingual repertoires and being able to connect to sociolinguistic justice. An example of that was as a beginning bilingual teacher. You heard Elvira say that I was born in Cuba. Well, none of my students were from Cuba, and we didn't speak the same Spanish variety that I grew up speaking. And being able to connect with them meant learning more about what their linguistic trajectories are, their repertoires were, and being able to support that in their acquisition of academic Spanish and literacy in Spanish. So, some of the products that you see here along the way include the Jornada Pedagógica, the activities and the products. The Jornada Pedagógica, how many of you have attended a Jornada Pedagógica here? That's amazing. That's wonderful. More than half of you. The Jornada Pedagógica came to LMU after it was launched in Los Angeles Unified School District and where I had attended as a teacher. And it was an amazing space, a Spanish language conference for Spanish bilingual teachers with a unique opportunity to support and live not just our pedagogic practice, but also our intellectual ability and our intellectual engagement. So the jornadas brought amazing speakers. It was a collaboration between Mexico, Spain, and the United States, and it offered support for teachers, families, and students becoming bilingual. And that's this year, we celebrated our 32nd year here at LMU for remaining perhaps the sole and only conference held completely in Spanish in California, but perhaps in the country. The second is that blue document that you see in the middle. It's a little bit faded. The Estándares de Lectoescritura en Español. The passage of 227 had just an amazing, devastating effect on those of us in bilingual education. And yet, our students were still in the classrooms. And yet, we have bilingual teachers who were very isolated and marginalized, and they received no support. So, in that time frame, this was 1999 when the state of California adopted the new English language arts standards. There was no intention at all of supporting bilingual teachers, of using an adaptation of those standards for Spanish. There were still a few bilingual programs around. It was much more difficult for families to opt in. And so we created this fugitive publication. Fugitive, you may ask, why? Because did the state ask us to do it? No. Did the state bless it? Did they adopt it? No. But through that joint construction of knowledge with colleagues such as Silvia Dorda Duque de Reyes and Emilio Rojas, we created these Spanish adaptations because there was an amazing need to, number one, validate and ensure the language and pedagogy experiences, and also at the same time give them a tool, a resource for them to be able to use. It was never adopted by the state of California, but fortunately the San Diego County Office of Education published it and disseminated. And that's a faded copy that you see there of the estándares. Today, we have the Spanish to language development standards, which are officially adopted. Fortunately, we were able to run effective campaigns and engage politically to overturn Proposition 227 in 2016 through Proposition 58. And now we have a resurgence of bilingual, dual language, bilingual education programs, but that are still with some challenges. We face gentrification. You've written about this. And I know, Guadalupe, that you've written also about the dangers of curricularizing language. So when we had some of our initial conversations, I thought, well, I don't think Guadalupe would approve of the Spanish language standards because it really is curricularizing language.
Well, you have to really work with the world that you live in, right? And some things are really important. So, my writing on curricularizing language is probably an opposition to thinking that language, rather than lived, is taught and studied, right? So I worry about that. But that's not what you were doing with the standards. You were actually putting them forward as saying we've got to know that there's something that we want our children to reach and that they are going to be seen as the mainstream as well. If we have standards for the other children, we have to have standards for our children as well. So I applaud you.
Thank you so much. So it was not just a pedagogic act, it was a political act. And so this idea of trying and working towards transforming by being engaged civically means that every act that we do can be a political act. And that was a political action that my colleagues and I together took a stand and made a lot of work. We did it for free, right? It was not for money, but yet it had a significant message to our bilingual educators out there that it was a meaningful point of resource that they could use in their classrooms. So in the pedagogies of questioning, this goes back to the joint construction of knowledge and working collaboratively. It was also a book that came out during the 227 era, and there were a handful of bilingual teachers, and some of these teachers who were authors in this chapter accepted an invitation to work together on what's named teacher action research projects. And I don't see anybody here who is in that project, but some of them are teachers from Montebello Unified. And I know there's a lot of Montebello Unified people here. And these pedagogies of questioning really was this amazing collaboration. This book is published by CABE, that the teachers were the authors. We wrote this book and we wrote it in English and we wrote it in Spanish. And it took about 8 years to do both because teachers have important and busy lives and a lot of work to do and a lot of demands. But it was an invitation and a question about what would you like to learn with and from your students, and would you like to write about it for other teachers to learn? So these teachers did amazing inquiry projects in their classroom where they gathered data, they asked those critical questions. The idea of pedagogies of questioning came from some of the chapters from Paulo Freire, that teachers ask, what if I did something different to engage my students in these bilingual settings? And I'll give you an example of one because I think we're going to be running out of time. And I want to talk about the OPAL, Observation Protocol for Academic Literacy's book as well. And one of the examples from this book was from an algebra teacher, Maria Constantino, and she she was teaching pre 227 in Long Beach Unified School District, and she had a special class for newcomer students where she was teaching algebra in Spanish, and yet many of her students was failing. Maria is a native of Peru. She had an engineering background. She taught algebra. She had a strong mathematical competency, and yet she couldn't. She was tormented by the idea that she could not reach her students. So the question that she asked herself is, what if I incorporate interactive strategies with my students to be able to make sure that they are able to succeed, that they attend class, they come to my class, they want to participate, and they want to engage, and they want to be successful in algebraic knowledge. So she enacted 4 interactive strategies, and she did a semester-long study in her class, and she found a great difference in both their grades and the attendance patterns. So this idea of pedagogies and questionings is part of how we work, how we engage in our process of being intellectuals, teachers as intellectuals, and also teachers as authors in their own classroom. And the work that I wanted to share with Elvira, the co-author of the book, The Observation Protocol for Academic Literacies, has to do with a very long project. All of my projects take about 8 years. All the books take about 8 years. This is also, I don't know if there's something magical about 8 years, but it's really a tool to be able to provide educators with indicators of practices that are based on sociocultural and second language acquisition theories, hence harkening back to the idea of the joint construction of knowledge, and how can we support teachers in supporting each other around their practices, around these principles, around these uh, reflective activity and reflective engagement that will help support interactions, rigorous and relevant curriculum, connections to students and their families and their lives, and also to make sure that the content that we teach is really comprehensible. So those are the 4 areas of work that I wanted to share related to bilingual teacher pedagogy and pedagogy around supporting teachers of English learners.
Wonderful. So, Elvira?
Thank you so much for that insightful, first of all, the presentation of the vision and an opportunity to think about how that can help us frame our thinking. We do have audience participation. So if you have questions, please do upload them. We have one question that we'd love for our panelists to be able to respond to. And that is an invitation to share insights on how dual language immersion programs fit into the relationship between language and power, and how that relationship may affect the children we serve and our society.
I didn't mention this, but in case you didn't know, that there is an amazing festschrift, which is a tribute to Dr. Guadalupe Valdés's work by amazing and influential scholars in bilingual dual language education. And so this book is called Equity in Multilingual Schools and Communities, celebrating the contributions of Guadalupe Valdés. She did not want me to share this with you. I just have to say this. She did not. She told me, don't talk about me. Don't talk about my work. But I can't help it because Guadalupe's work is so important and impactful in so many scholars and in so many practitioners in the world of bilingual dual language education. So she might be a little bit mad at this point in time, but I have to share some of the work. And so some of the chapters in this book really talk about this idea of the gentrification of bilingual dual language education. And one of her mentees, Claudia Cervantes Soon, talks about ensuring, and others have talked about ensuring critical consciousness. And this idea, this question that is asked by the audience about ensuring that we provide equity and access to multilingual learners, students who are native speakers of a variety of language that have been minoritized, means that we have to make sure about what the power dynamics are, and not just the power dynamics in the classroom. So there are really wonderful examples of how native Spanish speakers in observational data, native Spanish speakers serve as language brokers for English native speakers, but yet the English native speakers do not do the same for the Spanish native speakers. And so for teachers, it's really important to be observers of this dynamic that happens in the classroom and to disrupt it, because there's no problem with being a translator or a language broker for each other, because we learn language by using language, right? We learn it in the engagement of interaction. But disrupting that power dynamic that happens in very young children and continues through life is really an essential part of ensuring equity in those programs. Guadalupe, did you want to add something?
Well, I'll just say that I got a lot of hate mail. I wrote an article long ago that was opposing two-way bilingual education. And it was not at a time where anyone had thought about gentrification. And I basically said that we were giving away our language cheaply to the children of the powerful. Okay. And so you can imagine a lot of people got very angry with me. Young scholars have now picked it up and said maybe we're doing that because there are power differentials in the two populations, and language does matter. And now we are giving children the gift of language, but sometimes our children are not getting back, as Magaly so well said, the gift of language.
Thank you.
So, coming back to your work. So, central to your work has been the policy work. And so, what I'd like you to do is to share about that work that you and your colleagues have engaged in, particularly in CEEL.
Well, it was just a phenomenal opportunity and a gift and a lot of hard work to be able to create a center that can be more engaged with our K and our pre-K 12 partners and other universities and other advocacy organizations that without whom policy change cannot happen. So going and building on the idea of transformative civic engagement has been also grappling with the idea of what it means to be an academic and a scholar in an institution of higher learning. Early on in my career, we have to go through the tenure process. And in the tenure process, in most universities, you have to publish. The idea of you have to publish, and you have to publish in certain ways. And it was a very large challenge for me to be able to be engaged politically, because there's a time investment factor in this, right? To be present and to be engaged and to be active in community and in policy work means that you have to give up some of that time for publishing. But we, through the work of the center, have been able to do some other kinds of alternative publications, and this is some of the work that you see here. To be able to get work, research, findings, studies that are more accessible, that are faster to share with the public, and that have many recommendations that can inform policy change. So some of those are our reports around the Local Control and Accountability Plan. In 2013, California adopted the local control funding formula, and the requisite local control meant that districts, LEA, had the responsibility and accountability to create and make decisions on their own. And they made those decisions public through the Local Control and Accountability Plan, with particular attention to the three targeted subgroup, English learners being one of them. So in this trajectory of work, 4 reports between 2013 and as recent as the last LCAP report, 22, we found that there was little attention to English learners, despite the fact that they're supposed to be one of the targeted subgroups and that resources are supposed to be given to them. And it's a matter of public policy and a matter of implementation at the local level through leadership, through engagement with families and schools to be able to change those. So those policy tools led to significant changes in the way that LCAPs are written. They led to policy pushes through our partners and advocacy organizations like Californians Together and CABE, who use the information in those policy reports to require legislative and school board of education changes. And that was done again in a joint effort with partners, with my colleagues such as Elvira and others, to be able to write about, to be able to do that deep thinking and read of an analysis of LCAP reports, which are not that fun to read, by the way, if you've ever read an LCAP report. But it was like looking in a microscope, looking for needles in haystacks to search for equity for English learners. We've advanced the work, but there's still more work to be done. Then some of the policy tools are about connected to teacher preparation. So my colleague here, Anaida Colón Muñiz, and I talked about the importance of sharing our history and building knowledge around Latinos and educational civil rights. Since I came to LMU, I had an opportunity to start a course on really kind of an ethnic studies course for bilingual teacher preparation called Chicano Latino Cultures and Interdisciplinary Perspective. There's a parallel course for Chinese Mandarin. And what I found is that there's a dearth of information about our history, our political history in this country, the laws that have oppressed Latinos in the US, and what we can do to counter them. But knowledge is the first step. You have to know what those policies are to be able to counteract them. So that book, Latino Civil Rights in Education, had stories from Puerto Rican Americans and policy groups, from Central American groups, and of course from Mexican American groups to say, what are our civil rights in education? First, we have to know what the history has been to be able to deconstruct it and then to reconstruct a new history for what we need to have greater equity and justice. And much of it had to do with linguistic justice and linguistic oppression and fighting against those books and then those laws. And then the final example, the image on the left, is again running up against the idea of what we publish and where we publish. So we created education and policy briefs. And those are a series of short studies, but impactful studies that have policy and practice implementation. They take a lot less time to publish. They're disseminated broadly. They're reviewed by others. And they have made some impact in terms of what we learned about preparing bilingual teachers, about bilingual teacher residencies. And most times we try to be a little bit ahead of the game in terms of sharing that information more broadly than it would normally take in a peer-reviewed publication.
That was so brilliant. I'm so glad you did that and continue to do that.
Again, it was not just me. It's an amazing collaboration with others and many who are here in this room and many who are not here in this room who've been great collaborators along the way.
And a little bit on that by providing advice. What advice would you have for educational leaders to address top-down policies that may overpower local policies, making it difficult for schools to provide quality educational programming for multilingual and English learner students?
That's a great question. In my doctoral classes, I teach a policy course. And one of the books and the videos that I'm going to then turn it to you to see what your recommendations are, because you have some of those words of wisdom as well. See, she doesn't want to do that. Okay. Yeah. but the book is by Eric Liu, and he was the chief staff lead writer for Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, and he wrote a book called "You're More Powerful Than You Think." So, some strategies around thinking about you're more powerful than you think is your voice and being present in those meetings where decisions are made, thinking of yourself as a leader, engaging with others, all of those four elements, right? For policy making and policy changing, understanding who your allies are and connecting with them and bringing them along because you're usually not alone and not the only one. And finally, also knowing who your enemies are, who your opponents are, and in that way being able to develop strategies and language and staying the course. One of the things that I learned in my role as CABE president and the director of state and legislative affairs is being on point with your message. Have 3 points and stick to them and continue to repeat them because it's part of a mantra that you need to develop, particularly when you're in any role that you feel that a change needs to be made.
Thank you. There's absolutely nothing I can add to what you said. That was so profoundly wise. So I want to move you now, though, to language and literacy, because I know you've thought very deeply about that and that you've been very concerned about the fact what happened, the impact of COVID on children that were incredibly vulnerable. And as we thought about especially the new policies that are coming in, especially this interest in that, the science of reading. And I wondered if you would talk and share with us a bit about those policies, what happened with AB 2222, how you were involved in that, and how should we think about what they want our teachers to know about literacy and how do children read?
Well, this is of literacy education, and the intersection of language and literacy education is a really complex subject. How many of you have heard about AB 2222? Okay. How many of you have heard about the science of reading? Okay. So the science of reading is a body of research that definitely is a body of research that exists that has been, in my opinion, carefully branded to really essentialize what literacy is, that has a limited application to English learners, and that it's wildfire in this nation about literacy policies that really exclude and really have a narrow interpretation. So policy, Richard Elmore, who's a great policy guru, talked about how he used to think that policy was the answer, and now he thinks that policy is a problem. And this bill, this legislation, which was recently, it did not make it through the session, it is an example of bad policy because it would have mandated science of reading instruction. Of course, a lot of people don't know the claims and assumptions, so it requires a very careful read of what they mean by the science of reading. They may sprinkle in English learners here and there in the bill to say, oh, we've addressed English learners because they're in the language of the bill. And it would have had an amazingly oppressive requirement for the preparation of teachers to teach reading, would have mandated that the state basically police our course syllabi to see if there are certain readings in there or certain approaches in there. It is intended to address a comprehensive approach to literacy instruction, but the problem is the policy, right? Because it's not just in what the policy says, but how it will be interpreted and mandated in there. So this idea of the undergirding claims and assumption is the work that we still have to do. There are counter forces at play, and some of the documents that you see here are how we use evidence-based research to ensure that English multilingual learners have equitable access to maintain their language, because again, the science of reading literature and the language is monolingual in focus. They may have done some brain science research that has been done with children in other countries, but it is primarily a monolingual focus, and it's basically a monolingual policy that will have very devastating effect on our bilingual dual language programs. And so it's not the first time that we've had policies like this. How many of you were around when No Child Left Behind was in force? So you remember what No Child Left Behind looked like and felt like in classrooms. And many of our colleagues in Los Angeles Unified School District that interpreted No Child Left Behind and Reading First, which was the reading policy at that time, talked about how literacy coaches would come into the classroom and monitor whether the teacher was on the page that they were supposed to be, on the day that they were supposed to be, in the hour that they were supposed to be. Does anybody remember that part? Okay. Now, some people would deny that happened. But if you were around, they would deny. They were called literacy police. There are some people in the science of reading camp that say, "Oh, that never happened." So going back to being civically engaged, you know that this bill is coming back around, and the elements of this bill can have very devastating effect on our bilingual programs and our literacy development. But even in an English mainstream classroom, it would have a very restrictive approach to the teaching of reading. But it's not. It's a complex question, right? What do we need to do next? Reading is something that we really need to do next. It called me back to some of my early days. My specialization at USC was language literacy and learning. And I've been involved in a lot of bilingual teacher prep work and not necessarily in the literacy research. So it required me to go back and do more reading and reinform myself about where has the field gone. But this was an imperative that I felt that I need to be engaged with. And on Saturday, I'm going to be at the Reading League conference and a panel with some of the folks who use only a narrow view of what the research says about reading. They have a narrow view of the research about reading. And to be able to ensure that when this legislation comes back around, it will come back around in another form with more specific language and with a different strategy to make sure that they are more successful this time. And we need to have a counter movement. So part of that idea of being civically engaged means knowing the connection between your voice and your role in policy making, even if it's in the classroom, and also your voice and your role in engaging with others, with partners, with other educational organizations to really uplift what the needs of our students are to make sure that as a leader, you are ensuring that linguistic justice continues.
I wonder, since you talked about reading, I wondered if you would share with us some of your early experiences, some personal experience about how you became a reader in English and Spanish. That's such a lovely story.
Well, I almost didn't become a reader in English. I really didn't learn how to read in English till fourth grade. And when my family came from Cuba, I was 3 years old. We spoke Spanish predominantly in the house. We moved up the East Coast to New York. I went to New York public schools and I learned to read words in Dick and Jane. Any of you read Dick and Jane? See, spot, run, go. Yes. So I could read those words, but I didn't know how to read. And one year when I was in second grade, we lived in a neighborhood where my dad and mom felt that I shouldn't go to the school, that I should stay home, and that my dad taught me how to read the Spanish newspaper. That's how I learned how to read in Spanish first. And I learned how to do math because he was a waiter and he brought I learned how to count money, always very motivating for children, by collecting all his tips and adding them up on his ledger. And then he would correct me. And then when I returned to school the next year, it was like a transitional year for me. So I really have what they call de facto bilingual education because that was the opportunity that I had to learn in Spanish first. But were it not for the insights that my father had, that taught me how to read the Spanish newspaper that he read every day, I don't know that where I would have ended up. So I'm forever grateful to my parents for not letting me. I mean, it's a sad story, isn't it? To keep me out of school so that I could become literate and not only become literate, but become biliterate as well.
Yeah, that's such a lovely story. I really appreciate it so much because, and when you said that, when she said when she was reading Dick and Jane, that she was not really reading, well, it depends. You know, some people think that reading is calling out words, you know, and some other people think that maybe reading is drawing meaning from text, right? But they're two very different activities, right? Just calling out words, which you could do, spot, run, whatever. I also was a Dick and Jane learner of English reading. And so we have our memories of what those frustrations were. But I want to then push you now into future directions. What about the future? What are you thinking about? What is there still to do? What do you have to say to some of the young people, some of the older people? What's before us? What do you think we need to continue to do?
I would say three things. Maybe in a Jesuit institution, we always think in threes, right? One is to have that clarity, that epistemological clarity, to be able to name what you believe and why you believe in it and how you came to be who the person that you are. And each of us has that unique opportunity and many gifts by virtue of the fact that you're here, that you're listening. You've been gifted with opportunities to continue to enhance your learning in your advocacy and your engagement. And so that would be the second thing, to consider how you might be engaged, because as Paulo Freire says, education is a political act, and by the virtue of the fact that we are in education, in educational spaces and in educational roles, that we have an obligation to carry out language and educational justice by including our voice in spaces where our voices are needed, and they are definitely needed. And the third thing would be to also work with others, right? This idea of the joint construction of knowledge and sociocultural spaces that really inform and build knowledge together is the fact that nobody can do it on their own, right? None of us got here on our own. All of us were taught by teachers. We can think of wonderful teachers, and also to think about leadership as a leadership position in whatever seat you're in, that you're a leader. If you're a teacher, you make policy decisions every day by the way you engage with students, by the language that you use or you facilitate their use regardless of the instructional setting time. That's a language policy decision that you make in the classroom. And ultimately, that there's more work to be done, that we can't be satisfied with where we are right now. There's more work to be done. Just when we thought that in 2016 we overcame Proposition 227, now we have the reading wars that are in front of us again. And the reading wars compel us to engage and act politically and inform ourselves and relearn and reread some of the things and read those policy mandates very carefully to see what's in the text, but it's also what's in the subtext.
So, in terms of your own personal work, what are your next steps?
My next steps, well, just recently, when Dean Shelton said that he twisted my arm for certain things, he did. One of the things that he twisted my arm to do was to resume the role of the academic program director for the bilingual programs here at the School of Education, which is my passion and my heart and where I started and why I chose the language and literacy and culture specialization when I went to my PhD Title VII program with Reynaldo Macias. I chose language, literacy, and learning versus policy, but I was always interested in policy. But it was really because I wanted to become a bilingual teacher educator. So I want to return to that, but I've learned a few things since it's a 15-year span. Um, that would be my third job here at the School of Education. And so I'm going to need a lot of help. So I'm going to call on you. Many of you here are my former students. Raise your hand if you graduated from LMU in the bilingual program. There are some of you. I'm going to be calling you. We're going to need each other to really make sure that the next generation of bilingual teachers, my colleagues who are here, my faculty colleagues who are in Zoom and who are in this space, we need to work together to be able to rebuild that program to create the next generation of bilingual teachers. It's not going backwards, though. It sounds a little bit like it's going backwards, but it's not. It's moving forward with new knowledge and this other point of clarity about we need to continue to use what we learn together to ensure that we have equitable policy and practices that uplift the linguistic genius of our communities, of our children, of our youth, of our young people, and of our adults and families too.
Absolutely. And I worry a lot about movement of peoples around the world, right? Because as we see, people are so threatened by people coming in. But that's not going to change. Somebody said the global south is coming north. And it's not just in the United States, right? So it seems that the problems that seem to be there are here. What thoughts do you have about the new influx of people, the new influx of Spanish speaking people, and how that will affect how you think about bilingual education?
It's not really a new influx, right? It's this idea of we are a transnational community as Latinos in the US, as Latinos in California. The configurations might be here. Uh, One of the aspects that I want to work on together with everybody, with some of my colleagues here, is particularly with Indigenous communities and Indigenous languages who have also been erased. Um, so, Will Perez and Ernesto Colin, I want us to be the first institution of higher education to offer bilingual authorization in an Indigenous language. You heard it here first. I want us to do that. I would love to do that together because this idea of monoglossic languages, that Spanish is a monoglossic, it's a colonizing language. We have been the oppressor for many of indigenous languages. And so I think that's a next step that I would love to do and to do it together as well. And we need to continue with this literacy, the literacy wars that we're facing, because it's the other side of the coin of linguistic justice, right? Linguistic and education justice.
And they're powerful enemies there.
There are powerful enemies there, and they're powerhouse people working on a national level.
Exactly. Elvira?
The questions from our audience is specific to Indigenous languages. And so I'm going to ask if you could please extend a little bit on that. This question says, can you comment on ways educators can affirm, support, and teach to multiple Indigenous languages present in our schools today, where students are developing not only the English language, but also Spanish as their third language?
That's a great question. And I think that part of the response is this idea of recognizing our children as multilingual geniuses. To be able to navigate three languages is an amazing feat. And we need to support teachers to be able to ensure that they are facilitating those multilingual language uses in the classroom. We talked a little bit earlier, we were talking about this idea of language brokering in bilingual dual language classrooms. Well, teachers, even if they don't speak those languages, can help students use those languages, can recognize that bilingualism is a superpower, multilingualism, trilingualism is a superpower. So if you don't speak the language of your student and you're a monolingual English speaker, you can still facilitate multilingualism in your classroom by honoring the language that they speak and honoring the language of the home, the languages of the home as well.
It really challenges us to think about the intersectionality between literacy, language, and content. There's one last question. I love this. We have time for one last question. There's a participant who wants to know more about research projects that you're engaged in and is volunteering in case we need schools or subjects.
That's amazing. Please see me at the reception. So we have a very exciting, well, we have very many exciting projects. One of which is around looking at the diversity of the English learner population, because it's not just one monolithic group. And one of our emerging projects has to do with Black multilingual learners. And in California, we have a relatively smaller population of English learners who are Black. It's close to 2%. But there are significant numbers of Black multilingual learners. We just had Dr. Ayana Cooper, and we're ready to engage with the State Department of Education to do kind of a landscape analysis of how do districts even identify who their students are who identify as Black English learners, and what are they doing to support them? So we want to get to the support question first, like what are educators, administrators doing to support English learners who are Black? How do they participate fully in the school? So that's one project. Another project is extending the work on our adolescents, and we have an early childhood project. So we have about 5 projects that we really want to collaborate with you, because it's really about how we work together to learn, to have deeper learning. And the second one that I want to uplift is just our super diversity project. So our center has been engaged with school districts, 3 school districts across the state, to interview adolescents who are super diverse and meet the definition of super diversity, not just in terms of intersectionality, so your country of origin, your gender orientation, ethnic background, language background, cultural background, socioeconomic status, many layers to super diversity. And understanding what our super diverse students tell educators about how their experiences have been in school and what messages they give to us to change learning systems so that they could feel more successful. So they're telling us amazing thing about what practices they find most that their teachers did that are most connected to who they are as human beings, that support their identity and not just their academic outcomes. So that's an ongoing project. So yes, please reach out.
About Magaly is that she's an amazing storyteller. So it's been an absolute privilege and pleasure to hear about her journey, about the way in which she frames the work, the world, and most importantly, the way in which she's engaged all of us. Thank you also to Dr. Guadalupe Valdés, who has agreed to join and very gently pushes Magaly and us to really think about the clarity that we bring to the work. So this evening, we have engaged in a conversation to challenge, expand, and bring ideological clarity to our conceptualization of linguistic justice, central to our collective responsibility for moral and ethical leadership in the education of linguistically plural students and their families. This insightful dialogue with our renowned scholars has raised awareness, critical consciousness for moral and ethical leadership, really emphasizing ways that hierarchies of oppression and exploitation can restrict, limit, or deny individuals or groups of people access to their full potential. In response to this, I know I can speak collectively for us here who are at 7 p.m. dedicated to this conversation. We affirm that culture and language are not an addition, but rather a critical component of education. These elements matter in co-constructing and fostering learning environments for the families and students we serve. They matter in advocacy, they matter in policy, and linguistic justice, thinking specifically about literacy, leadership, and practice for multilingual learners. Magaly shared with us, you are more powerful than you think. And together, we embody that. Your presence this evening, your leadership, your commitment matters and is much appreciated as together, we champion la lucha por la justicia. Please continue the conversation and join us for refreshments in the East Atrium. We'd love for you to also not only meet each other, but also meet members of our center team and our School of Education. Thank you to our CEEL team members whom you've met out in the hallway in here for really supporting all of the logistics. And most importantly, thank you for your presence. Let's give our honored guests a huge round of applause.